23 ayes and 0 noes.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered to be reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. Pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 7334, the Detain and Deport Illegal Aliens Who Commit Robbery Act, for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report it favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 7334 to amend the Immigration Nationality
Without objection,
Act.
the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In just 3 years, the Biden administration has allowed more than 6 million illegal aliens into our country, 4.4 million deliberate releases, and 1.8 million known gotaways. Now, that's a combined population the size of the entire state of Missouri, our 18th largest state with 8 congressional districts. The Mexican drug cartels fully control the border. No one gets through without their permission. Every migrant pays a steep toll to them for illegal entry into the United States, and most enter owing them thousands of dollars. These debts are brutally enforced by the cartels in our own country, amounting to slavery for those in their thrall. Violent foreign gangs now do their bidding. MS-13, Tren Aragua, and others are already well entrenched in our major cities, openly recruiting young illegal migrants to do their bloody business. Now, we've warned for years that the Democrats' open border policies would soon produce the criminal gang and cartel violence now common in third world countries like Mexico, in our own neighborhoods and in our own communities, and it's clear that that's now happening. As just one example, earlier this month, NYPD officers arrested 5 migrants in a sting operation looking into a gang of criminals who use stolen mopeds and scooters to violently snatch phones and wallets from pedestrians, mainly women. As of February 5th, police had named 9 suspects, all from Venezuela, Ecuador, or Colombia. We all know of the 9 illegal migrants who beat New York police officers, were released without bail, and fled. One was just rearrested for robbing Macy's a week ago Tuesday. Just last week, a 15-year-old Venezuelan in a taxpayer-paid shelter shot a Brazilian tourist during a botched robbery in Times Square and then opened fire on police. 4 were arrested in Troy, Michigan for multiple smash and grab robberies at a mall. In Chicago last week, 4 Venezuelan migrants who'd been here for less than a month and had already racked up 3 arrests for retail theft and, of course, immediately released, choked a CTA train rider into unconsciousness during a vicious robbery. Kyla Hamilton was murdered in her own home by an El Salvadorian migrant that this administration released into our country, despite the fact he had a tattoo identifying himself as an MS-13 gang member. Kayla's grieving mother addressed the Immigration Subcommittee last year. Laken Riley's young life has now been added to this growing butcher's bill for the Democrats' open border policies. The suspect in that case, deliberately allowed into the country, deliberately released by this administration, committed multiple crimes, repeatedly released by Democratic prosecutors, and now this. How many such monsters have the Democrats already allowed into this country? How many more will they allow before the American people stop them? This bill arises from Secretary Mayorkas's infamous memo that instructs ICE not to necessarily remove illegal immigrants, even if they are required to be removed by existing law for criminal acts. Here's how that works. Under the Trump administration in 2019, ICE arrested illegal aliens who accounted for 4,700 robbery charges and convictions. Last year, despite a 153% increase in border encounters, ICE arrested aliens who were responsible for only 3,100 robbery charges and convictions, a drop of 35%. So while more illegal aliens are entering the United States than ever before, ICE is removing fewer criminal aliens from the United States. In fiscal year 2023, the Biden administration removed nearly 60% fewer criminal aliens with criminal convictions and criminal charges than the Trump administration did in fiscal 2019. Again, despite a 153% increase in illegal migration. So in what world does this make sense? According to a staff report released by this committee just last month, DHS's own data show that there are 618,000 aliens on ICE's non-detained docket who have criminal convictions or pending criminal charges. That means that more than 500,000 criminal aliens are in U.S. communities, free to reoffend and victimize even more Americans. The threats of Biden's policies are widespread, but this bill takes a small stab at common sense. The Detain and Deport Illegal Aliens Who Commit Robbery Act requires ICE to lodge detainers against illegal aliens who commit a robbery offense and mandates that such aliens be detained in ICE custody. In doing so, the bill conforms to existing law that mandates detention and has been upheld by the Supreme Court. By mandating the detention of illegal aliens who commit robbery, including those who are charged with or arrested for a robbery offense, this bill creates safer streets for every American and allows for such criminal aliens to be more quickly removed from the United States. I urge my colleagues to support the Detain and Deport Illegal Aliens Who Commit Robbery Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Nadler, for an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, robbery is a serious offense, and those who commit such a crime, regardless of their nationality or immigration status, should be prosecuted under our laws. H.R. 7334, however, is an overly broad bill that would result in extremely harsh and unintended consequences. It does not actually solve the problems with the immigration system and is just another attempt to target and scapegoat migrants. Under this bill, any immigrant who is present in the United States without admission or parole and who is charged or even merely arrested for robbery would be subject to mandatory detention by the Department of Homeland Security. While at first glance this may seem reasonable, there are some very serious flaws with this approach. First, this bill would result in immigrants, even some currently in a lawful status and who have been in the country for a long time, being subjected to mandatory detention. For example, imagine a scenario in which police officers are responding to a bank robbery and they arrest the wrong individual due to a case of mistaken identity. By the way, this is not a far-fetched scenario. It actually happened earlier this month in Rennes, Georgia, when officers erroneously arrested someone for bank robbery and he spent 1 day in jail before bonding out. In another real-life example, a Detroit man was arrested and charged with armed robbery after the police traced the car used in the robbery to a man with his name. But the actual robber, as described by both the victims and his relatives, was 20 years younger than the man who was arrested. Despite this, he spent over 2 weeks in jail before a judge released him on bond. As our colleague Mr. Massey noted when considering a different bill at markup 2 weeks ago, people within ethnic and racial groups share similar names, which can lead to false positives on background checks and cause punishments to be handed down to innocent people who happen to share the same name as someone who committed the crime. This can lead to unfair racial disparities, which Mr. Massey wisely sought to combat with respect to gun background checks. It also puts many innocent people in jail, and this problem would only be exacerbated if the bill before us became law. If either of the individuals I discussed had entered the United States as a child without permission many years ago, but was now a DACA recipient or had temporary protected status, what would have happened under this bill? They would have had an immigration detainer placed on them. This means that they would be picked up by the Department of Homeland Security and would be subject to mandatory detention, even though they were lawfully present and were wrongly arrested. Does that make our country any safer? Moreover, under the Immigration and Nationality Act, a non-citizen who is convicted of or who admits to committing a crime involving moral turpitude or a CIMT is already subject to mandatory detention. Serious robbery offenses are generally considered a CIMT. However, the key here is that only those individuals who admit to or who are convicted of robbery would be subject to mandatory detention. But this bill goes way beyond that and mandates detention even for non-citizens who are charged or simply just arrested for robbery, regardless of the actual circumstances at hand. That is an overly broad and punitive expansion that I cannot support. I don't understand what my colleagues are trying to accomplish with this bill. Subjecting a wide range of people with lawful status, including DACA and TPS recipients, to mandatory detention is not a sensible policy choice and is not a good use of our limited enforcement resources. As we all know, Congress has never appropriated, and no administration has ever even requested, sufficient resources to detain all non-citizens who fall under the mandatory detention categories. Why then are we broadening the scope of mandatory detention to include those who are charged with or merely arrested for robbery offenses? This bill also violates our bedrock principles of fairness and due process, ensuring that people have their day in court. Since when do we as Americans subject individuals to mandatory immigration detention simply because they were arrested or because a prosecutor decides to bring charges, even though the charges may be swiftly dropped? I am also for protecting our communities from harm, but not with this overly broad and punitive legislation that does more harm than good. I hope the majority is willing to work with us to improve this bill to ensure that it is appropriately targeted at behavior that actually puts our communities at risk. Mr. Chairman, before I close, let me observe that a few weeks ago we considered a number of bills that all followed the same format, basic format. Find a heinous-sounding crime, even better if you can find a recent anecdote, then craft a bill with sweeping immigration consequences that go far beyond what is actually necessary to address the issue at hand. Require indefinite detention and deportation of certain immigrants merely accused of committing such a crime, even if they are lawful long-time residents, like legal permanent residents, or have a lawful status like DACA or TPS. No due process required, also that you can demonize immigrants and sound tough without actually making the country safer. Then repeat the whole process over again with the next bill. Today we are considering 3 more bills along these lines, and I expect that we will see yet more in the weeks to come, none of which stand a chance of passing the Senate. Thank God. Surely, we have better use of this committee's time. Instead of working towards bipartisan solutions to fix our broken immigration system, House Republicans dismissed out of hand a border bill negotiated by some of the most conservative members of the Senate, a bill that Senator McConnell said was the strongest border bill in 30 years. Meanwhile, we are hoping to avoid yet another Republican-led government shutdown as chaos and dysfunction continue to rule the day in the House. House Republicans are out of ideas and incapable of governing, so they retreat to their tired playbook over and over again, taking up bills that will make no meaningful difference and have no chance of becoming law simply because they think it will yield some political advantage. What a shame. I yield back.
Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7334.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered base text for the purposes of amendment. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California to explain the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, the amendment simply makes technical changes and doesn't affect the underlying substance of the bill. I yield back.
Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman, our gentle lady from Texas.
thank you. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report.
Ask unanimous consent to be considered as read. And I really apologize for my
Amendment to
voice.
the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7334 offered by Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentleman from California reserves a point of order. The gentlelady from Texas is recognized to explain the amendment.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. Recognizing that Texas is in the eye of the storm, and those of us from Texas have consistently reached out to bring people to our districts, specifically in this congressional era, Congresswoman Escobar, and before that time frame, we would be going out of the necessity because of the crisis. We want to work effectively for bills that deal with the crux of the problem. I've already said that I want us to get the data so that we know who migrants really are. But certainly those who are destructively criminal are not those that we desire to be amongst us. And so I think it is important that no one is tagged by being soft on crime, but really being fair and just. So specifically, this amendment strikes the following language: is charged with, is arrested for, so that an arrest or charge for a robbery offense is not sufficient to subject an immigrant to mandatory detention. This bill is a solution searching for a problem. Get the bad guys off the street, we understand that, but also give the courts the discretion on the particular circumstances so that we are not talking about persons being, in essence, denied their movement for whatever reason, just without giving the courts their decision-making capacity. This is, again, my amendment deals with people who have simply had suspicion or arrested. This is not conviction. As it stands, this bill would subject those individuals to mandatory detention. I would think we would understand that to be basically unacceptable, because bad things happen when you have mandatory issues and you do not give the opportunity for the person, whoever it may be, to be heard. In a situation where an immigrant is wrongfully arrested for robbery due to mistaken identity, for example, that individual would now be subject to mandatory detention even though they're arrested by mistake and never charged with a crime. As a ranking member mentioned in his opening statement, this is not far-fetched and does actually happen. In fact, just last month, Harvey Murphy Jr., a Texas resident, was wrongfully arrested in Harris County for robbery in a case of mistaken identity. After being held in jail for nearly 2 weeks, he was released once prosecutors verified that he had not been physically present in the state when the robbery occurred. But during this time, he was allegedly attacked and raped by 3 men, leaving permanent physical and mental injuries. If this individual was a DACA or TPS recipient, he would be subject to mandatory detention under this bill, even though he was wrongfully arrested or never charged or convicted with a crime. This is not hypothetical. If the bill becomes law, there will be disastrous consequences. We can find ways to protect our law enforcement, to protect our communities. There is no doubt we are unified on that. And I recognize the need for meaningful criminal laws that hold perpetrators accountable. This bill, however, again, is a solution looking for a problem. But most of all, we do not want to be part of unfairly detaining individuals that will not pose a threat. And so I ask my colleagues to accept the amendment that Jackson Lee has offered. The Jackson Lee amendment is charged with, to strike the language that says is charged with or is arrested for, so that we can do the right thing in any form of comprehensive immigration reform. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields.
Withdraw the point of order.
The gentleman withdraws the point of order. Who seeks recognition? The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Couple things. I respect the ranking member, but boy, I thoroughly disagree with him on his statement. He spoke about the Senate bill, and I just want to briefly speak about that, even if we're digressing for a moment. The Senate bill was awful. It was terrible. In fact, the supposed conservative senator who helped to put this together is censured in his own state for what he did by the legislature there. The bill didn't finish building the wall. This terrible bill didn't expedite sending people back to the country of origin. This bill didn't maintain or actually put in place again, which worked, the Remain in Mexico policy. This bill didn't stop catch and release. That's only mentioning a few. It actually codified, it made legal what is an illegal activity. I don't get what some folks refuse to get about this. We have all the issues and the problems that we have now because we're allowing an illegal activity to take place and pretending that it's legal. It reminds me, in some jurisdictions where they're trying, liberal prosecutors, to reduce penalties from felonies to misdemeanors so they can say their felony count has gone down and that their city is getting safer. You can't codify, you can't make legal illegal activity. And that's, one of the many problems with the Senate bill. It was literally better to do nothing than to do that Senate bill. It wasn't compromised, it wasn't good, it was completely unfocused and wrong, and I think we've seen that. And that's why it didn't even come up for a vote in the Senate. It has nothing to do with Donald Trump, it has nothing to do with the House. At the end of the day, they couldn't even get it up for a vote. I know Ms. Jackson Lee, no, actually it was the ranking member, mentioned Georgia. And I thought he was going to mention the case of Lincoln Riley in Georgia, innocent young college student who was murdered by somebody who was illegal and shouldn't have been on the street. It's just common sense, man. I mean, I don't know what we're doing in this country. You can't bring this woman's life back. For all the talking points you may have, she's dead. And then finally, addressing the amendment, there is a mechanism for this. And I could go through, I won't, all of the precedent in the immigration courts over and over again. We now already can detain people, especially when we consider them dangerous, who have only been accused. This is nothing new. It's nothing we haven't done before, but we need to enforce it. And if there is something wrong, if it is a mistaken identity, if it is a problem where somebody shouldn't have been accused or shouldn't be detained or shouldn't be deported, they are going to have their day in the immigration court. Due diligence will be served with this legislation. I support it. We need to pass it. I think we need to show the American people, for God's sake, that we're trying to do something to stop what's happening.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
I will yield.
I'm very curious about the mention you made of the Senate bill that it would codify something that is currently illegal. Would you mind sharing with us what you're talking about?
I reclaim my time. It would allow up to close to 2 million illegal aliens to be processed and pushed through into our country every year. And if the president chose to, he could change the ceiling and allow more than that. Supposedly there was a maximum limit, but it gives him the jurisdiction to go ahead and actually increase that number. That's wrong. That's not what people are looking for. We need to button up the border. Once the border is buttoned up and we know that we're safer, then we can look at immigration laws and look at the areas that need to be adjusted to allow good, legal immigrants that love this country. When you see, and I'm going to talk about this later, but when you see that there were individuals in New York who were beating the daylights, a ton of them beating the daylights out of 2 cops, and then they did get arrested. They were released the next day, and as they walked out, they gave the double middle finger to the United States of America and to all of us. I mean, that's just wrong. I mean, let me tell you about, and I spoke about this last time, the legal immigrants that we want in America are people who love this country and pledge their support for the United States of America. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. What purpose does the gentlelady from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am rising in strong support of my colleague, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee's amendment. It is a very good amendment. It would simply bring the bill more in line with current law by requiring that an individual actually be convicted of or admit to committing a robbery offense in order to be subject to mandatory detention. That seems like a very reasonable amendment, and I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will support it. Last month, my Republican colleagues were busy trying to deport immigrants, including lawful permanent residents, without requiring a conviction before removal. Today, they want to subject immigrants, including those in a lawful status, like DACA or TPS, to mandatory detention, even if they are never charged with a crime. When it comes to immigration, it seems that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle can only think in terms of enforcement, even though that very enforcement-only approach has proven to be wholly ineffective. Even the most draconian immigration laws have not prevented people from seeking refuge here, and expanding the mandatory detention criteria will not keep us safer. The Immigration and Nationality Act has impossible requirements that no administration has ever been able to meet, and no Congress has ever appropriated sufficient funds to detain everybody that is listed in the current mandatory detention categories. And despite that fact, my Republican colleagues' answer is they want to expand those categories. Under this bill, a wide range of people, including DACA and TPS recipients, would be subject to mandatory detention simply for being arrested for a robbery offense. It doesn't matter that these individuals may never actually be charged with a crime, or that their arrest could be a case of mistaken identity, as the ranking member described. Arrests due to mistaken identity are bad enough, but as Mr. Massey discussed in an earlier iteration of this markup, there are real concerns about racial disparities in the development of artificial intelligence and facial recognition tools. In one particularly egregious case, a Detroit woman was arrested for robbery and carjacking after she was improperly identified by an automatic facial recognition search. At the time of her arrest, she was 8 months pregnant. The police handcuffed her in front of her crying daughters and her fiancé and held her for 11 hours before she was released on a $100,000 bond. Prosecutors did not dismiss the case against her for another month. If the woman had been on DACA or TPS, under this bill, ICE would have been required to pick her up upon her release, and her son would have been born in immigration detention. And this is all despite the fact that she did absolutely nothing wrong. This bill is a very serious and broad expansion of current law. It's also unnecessary, by the way. Immigrants who admit to or are convicted of serious robbery offenses are subject to mandatory detention under the Immigration and Nationality Act, and there's no justification for an expansion that mandates detention for those who are simply arrested or charged with robbery. People are often wrongfully arrested, or they're arrested and never charged with a crime. Right now, ICE is detaining more people than Congress has authorized funds for. Even still, this administration, like every other administration before it, is not even close to detaining everyone in the mandatory detention categories. I also worry that this legislation will make communities less safe. Under this bill, an individual that is subject to mandatory detention would have an immigration detainer placed on them so that they can be picked up by the Department of Homeland Security. For this to work, local law enforcement agencies would have to hold the immigrant until ICE is able to take custody. Local law enforcement agencies, however, need to have the trust of all of the members of their community, including immigrants, to effectively do their job. But that trust can be eroded if state and local law enforcement officers are viewed by the immigrant community as working on behalf of ICE. The Major Cities Chiefs Association has specifically addressed this issue, stating that lack of trust in local law enforcement can, quote, result in increased crime against immigrants in the broader community, create a class of silent victims, and eliminate the potential for assistance from immigrants in solving crimes or preventing future terroristic acts, end quote. Instead of working together on a bipartisan solution to fix the broken immigration system, here we are marking up a bill that has zero chance of becoming law. I hope my colleagues will work with us to pass this amendment and to accomplish a real goal of addressing immigration instead of passing more flawed bills like this. I yield back.
Yields back. The gentleman from North Dakota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know who's subject to mandatory detention? Anybody charged with robbery in federal court. U.S. citizen, non-U.S. citizen, anybody. It's a presumptive detention hold. Like it or not, illegal immigrants who are in this country are under the subject of federal jurisdiction. This isn't changing or expanding the law. It's allowing another federal agency to enact the law in the same way as which the federal court system does. That is the only difference. You want to talk about pretrial release reform in federal court, I'm your guy. Like, I'll sit down and work with anybody. But the reality is, if you're charged with robbery in federal court, you are going to be detained. The only difference here is we're asking another federal agency to apply the law in the same exact manner in which the federal court system applies the law. That's it. They are under federal jurisdiction. We wish they weren't. We wish they weren't here illegally, but when they are, they're under federal jurisdiction, not just the state in which they're in. All we're doing is applying the same rule to them that we apply to anybody else who is charged with this crime in federal court. Sure, we're moving it from one agency to the other in case they're charged in state court instead of federal court. If you're talking about wrongful detention, innocent until proven guilty, mistaken identity, I think there's a lot of people sitting in federal detention all across the country right now that would love to have that conversation because they don't get out.
Yeah.
There is no bond in federal court. You're either released or you're detained. All we're doing is saying that if you are an illegal immigrant and there is jurisdiction over you federally, we're going to treat you like anybody else who's arrested and charged federally. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Gentlelady from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to support my colleague from Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson Lee's amendment. I'd like to, in addition to supporting the amendment, it's so important that we keep correcting the record every time Republican colleagues misrepresent the facts. But my colleague, Mr. Van Drew, earlier was talking about the Senate bill, which, again, Republicans called the toughest border bill they have ever seen, and was trying to justify essentially opposing what is the toughest border bill Republicans have ever seen by claiming that the bill would allow 5,000 migrants to be processed into the country per day before the bill's provisions would be triggered. That's not true. And so it's either clear that Republicans didn't bother to read the Senate bill, or they want to provide some cover for taking Donald Trump's orders, which were, don't pass the bill because I don't want to solve anything. I want the problem, not the solution. What that $5,000 cap is, and this goes to actually all my Republican colleagues because I've heard all of them repeat what Mr. Van Drew repeated, to all the Republican colleagues who are misstating that information, the bill states that after 5,000 people have been apprehended, that's when the other provisions of the bill get triggered. Not when 5,000 people have been let in. They either know better and they're okay lying to the American public, or they're desperate to find cover as to why they bashed a bill that one of the most conservative senators in the United States Senate worked on and sought to bring not just out of the Senate, but to the House floor. I think it's important also to repeat, Mr. Van Drew, you missed my explanation. I'll repeat it quickly. The bill that came out of the Senate that had the $5,000 cap of people, which, when I asked you about whether, what concerned you about that bill, the 5,000 person is not 5,000 people admitted into the country, but once 5,000 people were apprehended, it would trigger other components of the bill. So I would encourage you to read the Senate bill because it's not what you it doesn't do what you asserted that it does. The other thing that I would say is while we are here talking about these bills, I recently met with federal law enforcement personnel from El Paso who are basically begging for the resources that the president asked for in the supplemental bill. And so not only can the federal government not do everything Republicans want it to do because it doesn't have the resources, but because we didn't pass the supplemental bill, there is a real deficit that poses a real risk to federal personnel because they just don't have the resources necessary. Again, I'd like to thank Ms. Jackson Lee for her amendment and for her effort to create some due process in this bill, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Americans are thankfully beginning to realize the danger of the policies that the Democrats have been advocating and imposing in our country where they take control. This bill simply says if an illegal alien who's already required under federal law to be detained is charged with robbery because they haven't been detained, they have to be taken into custody and taken off our streets. The Democrats oppose this even today. Even today. After all the violence that we've seen, Laken Riley's assailant had not been convicted of a crime when he was alleged to have brutally raped and murdered her. He'd only been charged with several crimes and then released back into our streets to the applause of the Democrats. Democrats here approve of this. Many of the victims I cited were assaulted or robbed despite the fact there were multiple charges already filed against them. How many Laken Riley murders are the Democrats willing to accept before we get serious about protecting Americans again? Let me remind my friends that illegal immigrants are required by the Immigration and Nationality Act to be detained under current law. That law is simply being ignored by the Democrats and their administration. Unfairly detaining individuals who do not pose a threat. That's what one of the Democrats just said this bill does. Unfairly detaining individuals who do not pose a threat. Would you listen to yourselves? Don't pose a threat? They cross the border illegally, a federal crime requiring detention under federal law, and they're released anyway. They're then arrested for other crimes, and they're released by leftist prosecutors anyway. And then they go on to commit heinous crimes, and they don't pose a threat? You know, we've been through these arguments in recent bills that require detainers against aliens committing ID fraud and assault on officers. Let me remind you, current law already provides for mandatory detention of aliens without convictions if they've admitted to committing a crime involving moral turpitude, drug trafficking, drug possession. But armed robbery, how dare the Republicans impose such an unfair provision for a harmless little crime like armed robbery? Are you even listening to yourselves? If you were, you might understand why Democratic constituencies across the country, in our inner cities especially, are now turning against you en masse. Again, we're talking about illegal immigrants who've already supposed to be detained under federal law. And there are already provisions for those aliens to contest such an order. Again, under current law, they can request review before an immigration judge who will then determine whether that alien is in fact an alien, whether he fits within the category of mandatory detention, and whether DHS is substantially unlikely to establish that he alone is subject to mandatory detention. So those due process provisions already exist, but I have to ask again, are you serious? You say this is going to make communities less safe by removing robbery suspects from the street? Really? Good luck explaining that to the American people. I yield to Mr. Van Drew.
Thank you. Just quickly, again, I want to go through it. The Senate bill was a political document to say that something was happening to correct the situation at the border. It was no more than that. It didn't finish building the wall. It didn't expedite sending people back to their county of origin. It didn't reinstitute the Remain in Mexico policy. It didn't stop catch and release. It did allow millions of illegals just being processed, but to be processed through and to come into the country.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will in a moment. I have to yield back actually to the gentleman from California. It does codify what we consider breaking the law. It is wrong. We need an immigration policy, but we need a good one that rewards those that love the United States of America, that pledge to this country, that care about this country. We just can't allow the existing situation to exist. I don't know how else to say it. It didn't even do anything like reinstituting something similar to Title 42. It didn't do any of it. It was a bad document. It was a bad bill. I yield back to the gentleman from California.
And I just want to emphasize, what this bill says is that if an illegal alien is charged with a robbery, we need to take them off the streets. And the Democrats are opposed to that. I think that speaks volumes.
Mr. Chairman.
Back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Chairman, the law has been completely misstated by the Republicans. Robbery is not a presumption of detention under current law. Armed robbery carries a presumption of detention under current law. This bill would say that you have to have detention for someone who's merely charged with or arrested for committing acts for robbery. Arrested or charged with. Frankly, that's un-American. What's with the Bill of Rights? If we're going to penalize someone by putting them in detention, it should be either because they have been convicted of a crime or because a judge under the applicable bail laws has decided that they must remain in detention pending trial because of a flight risk. That's what we should be doing. And that's true of a citizen, it's true of anyone legally present in this country. We are talking, remember, about people legally present in this country, not illegal immigrants. Someone legally present in this country who may have been here for 30 or 40 years should not be subject to gross violation of his civil liberties just because a police officer mistakenly, or perhaps not mistakenly, identified him as a bank robber, or, well, not a bank robber beyond robbery, but as a con man or something else. Now, let me say further. I don't have the statistics in front of me. But for all the Sturm und Drang and all the fear tactics, every statistical study that has been done shows that the rate of crimes committed by immigrants to this country, legal and illegal, is less than the rate of crimes committed by native-born Americans. Let me repeat that. The rate of crimes, serious crimes, non-serious crimes, committed by legal and illegal immigrants, either one, is less than the rate of crimes committed by native-born Americans. That's true for serious crimes, it's true for non-serious crimes. I wish I had the statistics in front of me, I don't. But all the demagoguery we've heard from our Republican colleagues saying that this country is threatened by a great crime wave because of illegal immigrants is pure hogwash. The fact is that this country is faced with something that we cannot tolerate, namely many people illegally crossing our borders, and we have to deal with that. But how do you deal with that if you don't have, and the Republicans talk about catch and release. Someone is caught by the Border Patrol and is given a claims political asylum, is entitled to an adjudication of that political asylum, claims political asylum, is given a trial date 5 years from now and released into the country. That's terrible. It is terrible. But why isn't that trial date 3 weeks from now instead of 5 years from now? Because we don't have enough immigration judges. We don't have enough asylum officers. The president has asked for funds to increase the number of Border Patrol people, to increase the number of asylum judges, to increase the number of immigration judges, so that these cases can be adjudicated quickly and you don't have what the Republicans call catch and release.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'll yield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to add a couple of things to this very important set of points you're making, because there was some real misstatements earlier. First of all, presumptive detention is not the same as mandatory detention. So those are two completely different things. In presumptive detention, you actually have the ability, you have to show that the person should continue to be detained. What we're saying in this bill is mandatory detention. That is completely different. Second, even if that were true, currently the list of offenses that carry a presumption of detention are drug cases with a maximum penalty of 10 years or more years of incarceration, use of a firearm in connection with drug charges, acts of terrorism, human trafficking, and most offenses against minors. Robbery is not on this list. So it is not correct what the gentleman on the other side was saying before. And then the final point I'll make is that you're completely conflating the immigration system, which is a civil system, with the criminal system. Those are two different things. And my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to act like they're the same thing. They are not. If you want to treat them like the same thing, then give every immigrant a public defender. You don't get that. You're just misstating the law for political purposes, or you don't know, I'm not sure, but it is incorrect and factually incorrect what is being said on the other side. I yield back to.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Question, gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to the ranking member.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I said a moment ago about the statistics. I now have the statistics in front of me, so let me give them to you. Immigrants, well, let's start from the beginning. There are currently 45 million people in the United States who are foreign-born. Obviously, some people among them are going to be criminals. Unfortunately, Fox News, Newsmax, and the Republicans generally want to fearmonger and scapegoat migrants for everything that's wrong in the country. But here are the facts. First, higher immigration is associated with lower crime rates. According to a 2015 study by the American Immigration Council, between 1990 and 2013, the foreign-born share of the U.S. population grew from 7.9% to 13.1%, and the number of unauthorized immigrants more than tripled from 3.5 million to 11.2 million. During the same period, FBI data indicates that the violent crime rate declined 48%, which included falling rates of aggravated assault, robbery, rape, and murder. The property crime rate fell 41%, including declining rates of motor vehicle theft, larceny, robbery, and burglary. Immigrants are 60% less likely to be incarcerated than are U.S.-born individuals. As I said before, here's the key statistic. Immigrants are 60% less likely to be incarcerated than U.S.-born individuals. Immigrants have a lower homicide conviction rate than native-born individuals. The homicide conviction rate for undocumented immigrants was 2.4 per 100,000 in 2015, which is lower than the homicide conviction rate of 2.8 per 100,000 for native-born Americans. Legal immigrants, that's undocumented immigrants, legal immigrants have the lowest homicide conviction rate of all, at 1.1% per 100,000 legal immigrants. And as a New Yorker, let me address some slander that's been alleged against my hometown. New York is the capital of crime. Nonsense. There's no migrant crime wave in New York. In fact, crime is down in New York this year, according compared to last year. It's down substantially since the 1990s, as it is everywhere in the country. New York's homicide rate is 4.8 per 100,000. Alabama's homicide rate is more than triple that at 15.8 per 100,000 people. More than 170,000 migrants have arrived in New York City since April 2022. But as the migrant numbers have increased, the overall crime rate has stayed flat. And in fact, many major categories of crime, including rape, murders, and shootings, have decreased in that time period, according to analysis of the New York City Police Department's month-by-month statistics since April 2022. So, because of baseless fear-mongering, this bill wants to do away with a basic American right of not being mandatorily incarcerated because you're charged or arrested for something you may not have done. And the difference between civil and criminal detention has already been pointed out. But these statistics are very convincing. Mr. Van Drew, Fox, Newsmax, Mr. Trump may all spout nonsense, but the statistics prove it is nonsense, and we shouldn't be guided by nonsense in making public policy. I yield back. I yield back to Mr. Johnson.
Would Mr. Johnson yield?
I'll yield to the gentlelady from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Van Drew, I need to, I caught two of the things that you mentioned that the Senate bill did not have, and I wanted to make sure you have the correct information. You mentioned that the Senate bill does not have Remain in Mexico, which H.R. 2 does have. Just for your information, the Mexican Congress essentially outlawed Remain in Mexico. So it's not possible for the United States to use Remain in Mexico, which is why I have called H.R. 2 a fantasy, because the much of what H.R. 2 depends on is its ability to expel all migrants to Mexico. Mexico has outlawed that and is no longer going to participate in that. The other thing you mentioned is that it does not end catch and release. It actually significantly increases, the Senate bill significantly increases detention capacity in order to do just that. I only say this not in defense of the bill, but in defense of facts. I yield back.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew.
Mr. Chairman, I know we got to vote, and I just can't let this go, I'm sorry. The president wanted more money because he wanted more money to process illegals. That was clear, and that was clear from the bill. It's clear in what he said. And as far as the discussion of how wonderful it is to have illegal immigration, and how it isn't a problem, and the more we have, the safer our country becomes, I suggest that everybody take a trip and speak to the parents of Lincoln Riley and tell her that that's true, tell those parents that's true. Tell that to the people in New York City that are literally losing their schools because they have to house illegals. Tell that to the legal immigrants, the good men and women that are legal immigrants that are the angriest about illegal immigration. Tell it to the citizens of the United States of America who more and more are expressing their concern about what's happening. They see it, they know it, they feel it in their daily lives, and they feel it in New York. And I'm not saying that. Neutral, liberal pollsters will tell you that. If it's better to open our borders wide, tell me what country has ever prevailed and survived throughout history by having open borders and just letting people in. The bill was a bad bill. It didn't have the catch. It didn't do anything significant. What needs to be done with catch and release. And I know whenever you mention the word, two words, President Trump, people get upset. Let's just talk about the administration. It was a trickle of illegal immigrants coming into the country, and now every year we set new records. We haven't done what we need to do. The bill was bad. If the bill was good, the sponsors and the leaders in the democratically controlled Senate would have been proud to push it through and put it in our laps if it was such a good bill. They couldn't even get it done in the Senate because it's not a good bill. It doesn't deal with the issue. I know it, you know it, the American people know it. They know that something's wrong. They feel it every single day. I yield back. I'm sorry.
Mr.
I
Chairman,
yield back to the gentleman from Oregon.
Yield to the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you. I know there's been some talk about what is and isn't detained. I used to do this for a living, and probably the reason it's not listed is because presumption of detention, any sentence over 10 years, any crime of violence. The first sentence of the robbery statute in federal court is by force or violence. You don't have to specifically list everything in order for the presumption to kick in, because the presumption on robbery kicks in because of the definition of the offense. And just so everybody is clear, if you've ever practiced in federal court, presumptive detention means detention. We can talk about it in a hearing room all day long and talk about all of these rights that you have and how it works. But the reality is when a prosecutor charges you with a crime in federal court, that will determine whether or not you were released prior to trial. For every citizen, US or otherwise, under the jurisdiction of federal court. And with that, I yield back.
Yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland is
Mr. Chairman, I
recognized.
have a unanimous consent.
Gentleman, the ranking member is recognized for unanimous consent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent for the following article from the New York Times on February 15th. Be inserted in the record. The title of the article is Migrant Crime Wave Not Supported by Data Despite High-Profile Cases. Several well-publicized acts of violence by migrants in New York have unsettled some city leaders, but police statistics do not point toward a surge in crime.
Without objection, gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield to the gentlelady from Washington.
Thank you. I just wanted to, again, go to the facts of unlawful migration under Donald Trump. From February of the first year that Donald Trump was in office until December of the last year he was in office, unlawful migration went up by 300%. So let's just try to talk about the facts in a way that actually reflects the truth versus whatever somebody might want to say. But it is absolutely incorrect to say that illegal immigration went to a trickle under Donald Trump. That didn't happen, despite the fact that he put in some of the harshest immigration provisions, because that doesn't work. It simply moves the cartels to try and game the system even more. It doesn't work. And the facts are that unlawful migration went up by over 300% in Donald Trump's tenure as president. I yield back.
I yield back to the chair.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition?
Hold on for 1 minute.
We have votes, as you can hear from the bells, votes being called on the floor. We could dispose of this amendment, but if the chair's probably not going to call us back, but I should even take out the word probably. We're not going to come back. I think we'll probably adjourn before we go to votes. But
Without objection, the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Texas is withdrawn.
okay, yeah. So we would have to perhaps withdraw Sheila's, the gentlelady's from Texas amendment.
And then we would withdraw the motion.
Then you can bring that back up when we resume the, even though the debate's been great, we're going to do it again is what I'm saying. Yeah. The, Mr.
Chairman.
Ivey, I know, is looking forward to that. That is-
Mr. Chairman,
Third time's a charm,
Yeah,
Mr.
buddy.
Chairman.
my understanding then, just to make it clear, is that as we that since we're not going to vote on Ms. Sheila Jackson Lee's amendment, it's going to come up again when we resume the markup.
Yeah,
She can offer it again when we resume.
yeah, yeah. So I think
you.
we'll probably, we got some good legislation done here, 3 bills. We'll resume when we come back in next week.
Okay, so without objection, the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Texas is withdrawn.
Without objection, the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Texas is withdrawn.
Without objection, the motion to favorably report the bill is withdrawn.
Without objection, the motion to favorably report the bill is withdrawn.
Okay, that concludes our business for today.
And that concludes our business for today. The meeting is adjourned.